Judge Marcus Wilson stares down the barrel of Officer Brennan's gun, his judicial robes soaked with rain. "On the ground, boy," the officer screams. Marcus smiles calmly. "I'm Federal Judge Wilson of the Ninth Circuit Court." The officer laughs. "Sure you are. Cuff him." Before we dive into this shocking story of justice turned upside down, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see what happens when corrupt cops mess with the wrong black man. The system might be broken, but sometimes justice finds a way. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Judge Marcus Wilson's elegant Oakland home, casting warm stripes across his mahogany desk, where case files were meticulously arranged. At 58, Marcus carried himself with the dignified bearing of a man who had spent decades commanding respect in federal courtrooms. His salt and pepper hair was closely cropped, his dark skin bearing subtle lines around the eyes that spoke of both wisdom and weariness. Today was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday, but the universe had other plans. Marcus adjusted his tie in the mirror, his mind already dissecting the arguments he would hear that afternoon in a high-profile police brutality lawsuit against the Riverview Police Department. The case alleged a systematic pattern of racial profiling that had resulted in multiple violent incidents against black citizens. The irony of what would unfold later that day had not yet revealed itself. Marcus had traveled a long road to his position on the federal bench. Growing up in 1970s Harlem, he had witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of systemic racism and over-policing in black communities. His father, a postal worker who believed fiercely in education, had pushed Marcus to excel academically despite the crumbling schools and low expectations placed on black children. His mother, a nurse working double shifts, had instilled in him an unwavering moral compass. Those early lessons had carried him through Harvard Law School, where he had often been the only black face in lecture halls. Even there, security guards had stopped him multiple times, assuming he didn't belong. Those experiences had shaped his judicial philosophy without compromising his belief in the possibility of justice. "Everything all right, dear?" Catherine, his wife of 30 years, appeared in the doorway. At 55, she remained as striking as when they'd met during his clerkship days. A sociology professor specializing in racial justice, Catherine had been his intellectual partner through every step of his career. "Just reviewing notes for the Riverview case," Marcus replied, closing the folder containing the latest threatening message he'd received. This was the third anonymous note warning him to recuse himself or face consequences. He hadn't mentioned them to Catherine, not wanting to worry her. "Those officers have a long history of complaints," Catherine said, pouring herself coffee. "The department keeps burying the records." Marcus nodded. "Which is why this case matters. If we can establish a pattern of behavior sanctioned by leadership, it sets precedent." Catherine touched his shoulder gently. "Just be careful. People who abuse power don't give it up easily." Marcus covered her hand with his. "I believe in the system I serve, even when it's flawed. That's the only way to improve it." The sound of his phone interrupted them. "Dad, Uda." His daughter Olivia's voice came through the speaker. At 26, she was in her final year of law school, following her father's path with her own fierce determination. "We still on for dinner tonight? I want to tell you about this immigration clinic I'm working with." "Absolutely," Marcus said. "I'm thinking of leaving work early to cook. How about that mushroom risotto you love?" After they hung up, Marcus gathered his briefcase. Despite the threatening notes, he felt a sense of purpose. Today's hearing was just procedural, but every step brought them closer to accountability. As he headed to his car, Marcus made a mental note to stop at that specialty market in Riverview on his way home. They carried those imported Italian mushrooms that made all the difference in his risotto. It was a small detour through the predominantly white suburb, but one he'd made many times before. He had no reason to think today would be different. Marcus pulled out of his driveway in his midnight blue luxury sedan, a vehicle chosen for its understated elegance rather than flash. He had earned his success, but never flaunted it. Still, to some, a black man in an expensive car was automatically suspicious. This thought flitted through his mind, but didn't linger. After all, he was a federal judge, a respected member of the legal community. Surely that counted for something even in Riverview. The rain began as a light drizzle when Marcus crossed the city line into Riverview. The suburban landscape changed subtly. Wider streets, larger houses set back from manicured lawns, and noticeably fewer people who looked like him. Marcus adjusted his windshield wipers and reduced his speed, ever the cautious driver. The digital clock on his dashboard read 3:30. Perfect timing to beat traffic, pick up ingredients, and still have ample time to prepare dinner before Olivia arrived. He didn't notice the police cruiser until it had been following him for several blocks. In his rearview mirror, Marcus could make out two officers inside their faces, indistinct. Officers Ryan Brennan and Jason Reynolds had been partners in the Riverview Police Department for 7 years. Both were white men in their mid-30s who had played football together in high school before joining the force. They had developed a reputation within the department for aggressive policing, particularly in cases involving minorities who ventured into Riverview from neighboring Oakland. "Check out that Benz, Brennan said, nodding toward Marcus's car. "Bet you $10 he doesn't live around here." Reynolds smirked. "Probably bought with drug money. Oakland's just over the bridge." "Let's see what he's doing in our neighborhood," Brennan replied, flipping on the cruiser's lights. Marcus felt a familiar tightening in his chest as the police lights flashed behind him. Despite his position, despite his age and accomplishments, the childhood lessons about police encounters never left. Move slowly. Keep your hands visible. Be respectful even when respect isn't returned. He pulled over, carefully positioning his car properly against the curb. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof. Marcus rolled down his window partway as the officers approached, one on each side of his vehicle. He placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. "License and registration," Officer Brennan demanded without preamble, rainwater dripping from his cap. His hand rested casually on his holstered weapon. "May I ask why I've been stopped, Officer Tied?" Marcus inquired politely, his deep voice steady. "I don't believe I violated any traffic laws." "You were driving suspiciously," Brennan stated flatly, "weaving between lanes." Marcus knew this was false. He had driven perfectly, as he always did. "I don't think I was weaving, officer, but I'll provide my information." Moving with deliberate slowness, he reached for his wallet. "I'm going to get my license now." "Just hurry up," Reynolds said from the passenger side, his tone impatient. Marcus handed over his license and registration, watching as Brennan scrutinized them with narrowed eyes. "Marcus Wilson," he read aloud. "Oakland address. What brings you to Riverview today, Mr. Wilson?" The absence of "sir" was deliberate, a small but pointed omission. "I'm going to the Italian market on Maple Street," Marcus explained calmly. "I'm a federal judge with the Ninth Circuit Court, and I'm heading home after work to prepare dinner for my family." Both officers exchanged glances, skepticism evident in their expressions. "A judge, huh?" Brennan's tone was mocking. "And I'm the Attorney General. Step out of the car, please." "Officer, there's no legal basis for asking me to exit my vehicle," Marcus stated firmly. "This appears to be a routine traffic stop based on a violation that didn't occur." "Are you refusing a direct order?" Reynolds demanded, his hand now also resting on his weapon. "No, I'm questioning the legal basis for your demand," Marcus clarified. "As a federal judge, I'm well versed in Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures." Brennan's face hardened. "I don't care if you're the King of England. In my jurisdiction, you do what I tell you. Now step out of the car before we have a problem." Marcus recognized the dangerous escalation taking place. He reached slowly for his phone. "I'd like to record this interaction for my protection and yours." "He's reaching a..." Brennan shouted, drawing his weapon with alarming speed. Within seconds, Marcus found himself staring down the barrel of the officer's gun, rain now pouring through the half-open window. "Hands where I can see them. Now." The sudden shock of having a firearm pointed at his face nearly froze Marcus in place. Decades of legal training years on the federal bench, and he was reduced to a target because of his skin color. "I was reaching for my phone," he said carefully. "My hands are now on the steering wheel." "Out of the car, on the ground." Brennan's voice had taken on a frenzied quality that frightened Marcus more than the gun itself. Officers losing control was when situations turned deadly. Marcus complied, opening the door slowly and stepping out into the rain. His suit, an expensive charcoal gray three-piece he'd worn to court that morning, was immediately soaked. "I am Federal Judge Marcus Wilson," he stated again, his voice raised to be heard over the downpour. "This stop is unlawful, and you are making a serious mistake." "On the ground." Reynolds had circled around his weapon, also drawn now. "Face down, hands behind your back." Marcus, he hesitated. Lying face down in a puddle seemed a deliberate humiliation, not a necessary safety precaution. "Officer, I've complied with your instructions to exit the vehicle. There is no need for—" He didn't finish his sentence before Brennan grabbed him roughly, spinning him around and slamming him against the car. The impact knocked the breath from Marcus's lungs. He felt handcuffs being applied, metal biting into his wrists as they were tightened excessively. "You're hurting me," Marcus managed to say. "These cuffs are too tight." "Should have thought about that before resisting," Reynolds replied, yanking Marcus away from the car. As they manhandled him, Marcus's wallet fell from his jacket, spilling its contents onto the wet pavement. Among them was his judicial identification card, the federal seal clearly visible even in the rain. Brennan kicked it aside without a glance. Across the street, several residents had emerged onto their porches, witnessing the scene unfolding. One had begun recording with his phone. Marcus noted this with a mixture of relief and humiliation. At least there would be evidence of what was happening. "Check the car," Brennan instructed Reynolds, pushing Marcus toward the police cruiser. "I bet we find something interesting." Marcus watched helplessly as Reynolds began searching his vehicle without consent, without probable cause, without a warrant. He knew exactly what was happening. They would find something because they would plant something. It was a tactic as old as policing itself. Standing in the rain, handcuffed and shivering, Marcus maintained his dignity. He kept his back straight, his expression composed, even as water streamed down his face. Inside, however, he was calculating. Every violated protocol, every ignored statement, every excessive action was being cataloged in his mind. These officers didn't know it yet, but they had just handcuffed the legal equivalent of a nuclear bomb. Their careers weren't just over. The entire department would feel the shockwave. But first he had to survive this encounter. For a black man in America, even a federal judge, that was never guaranteed. The humiliation of being transported to the Riverview police station in the back of a patrol car, a space Marcus had only seen before from the bench, was compounded by the officer's continuing commentary. "Got ourselves a real big shot here, Reynolds," Brennan remarked, glancing in the rearview mirror at Marcus. "Federal judge can't even drive straight." Reynolds chuckled from the passenger seat. "Probably got his position through some diversity program. They'll give anyone a robe these days." Marcus remained silent, preserving his energy and his dignity. His shoulders ached from the awkward position forced by the handcuffs which were still cutting into his wrists. His suit was soaked through, and without the heat reaching the back seat, he was beginning to shiver. But it was anger, not fear, that warmed him from within, a controlled, focused anger that would fuel what was to come. The booking process was designed to strip away dignity. Marcus was photographed fingerprinted and subjected to invasive questions about his personal history. When he repeated that he was a federal judge and demanded his phone call, the desk sergeant simply ignored him. "Charge him with resisting arrest, driving under the influence, and let's add possession with intent to distribute." Brennan told the booking officer, sliding a small bag of white powder across the desk, evidence that had mysteriously appeared during the search of Marcus's car. "Found this in the center console. This is fabricated evidence," Marcus stated clearly, making sure his voice carried to everyone in the room. "I demand a blood test immediately to disprove the DUI allegation, and I require my phone call as guaranteed by law." The booking officer looked uncomfortable, but continued processing the paperwork. "You'll get your call when we're good and ready," Brennan said. "Right now, we've got a drug dealer pretending to be a judge." Marcus fixed him with a level gaze. "I am Federal Judge Marcus Wilson of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. In approximately 30 minutes, when I fail to arrive at an important meeting, my clerk will begin calling hospitals, then police stations. Shortly after that, you will receive calls from the Chief Judge of the Ninth Circuit, followed by the Attorney General's office. I suggest you provide me with my phone call now to mitigate the damage to your career." "Boy." The booking officer paused, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Should I run his name through the system?" he asked Brennan. "Waste of time," Brennan dismissed. "Book him, then we'll deal with his fairy tales." But the seed of doubt had been planted. While Marcus was escorted to a holding cell, the booking officer quietly ran a search. 5 minutes later, Captain Richard Schultz, the afternoon shift commander, was rushing down the hallway, keys jangling at his belt. 53 years old, with a receding hairline and the beginnings of a paunch, Schultz had been with the department for 27 years and harbored aspirations for the chief's position. A federal judge in his jail was a career-ending catastrophe. "Wilsons," he called out, approaching the cell where Marcus sat alone on a metal bench. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Marcus rose slowly, his bearing regal despite his sodden clothing. "Captain Schultz, I presume there has been no misunderstanding. I was racially profiled, unlawfully detained, physically assaulted, and falsely arrested by your officers. Evidence was planted in my vehicle. I have been denied my phone call, and I am being held without legitimate charges. These are federal civil rights violations that will result in serious consequences for everyone involved." Schultz's face paled. "Let's get those cuffs off you right away, Judge Wilson. This has all been a terrible mistake." "The mistake, Almighty," Marcus replied evenly, "was assuming that a black man in an expensive car must be a criminal. The mistake was ignoring my identification as a federal judge. The mistake was violating my constitutional rights." "Those weren't mistakes, Captain. They were crimes committed under color of authority." As word spread through the station, a palpable panic took hold. Officers who had been lounging at desks suddenly became busy with paperwork. The booking officer was frantically trying to undo the processing that had already been completed. Brennan and Reynolds stood in a corner, engaged in heated whispers, their faces ashen. "Judge Wilson, we can resolve this quietly," Schultz offered after the handcuffs were removed. "I'll personally drive you home. We can forget this unfortunate incident." Marcus rubbed his wrists, noting the red welts left by the too tight cuffs. "I require my phone call immediately. I also require copies of all documentation related to my arrest, including body camera footage, which I trust has not mysteriously malfunctioned. Additionally, I want a medical examination to document my injuries." "Surely that's not necessary," Schultz began. "We can—" He was interrupted by a commotion at the front of the station. A regal woman in her early 60s, wearing a tailored suit and an expression that could freeze hell, swept past the protesting desk sergeant. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Where is Judge Wilson?" The Judge Allison Montgomery, Chief Judge of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and Marcus's longtime colleague, had arrived like an avenging angel. Behind her, two serious-looking men in dark suits who screamed federal agents scanned the room with practiced efficiency. "Allison," Marcus called out, relief evident in his voice for the first time. "Marcus?" She hurried to him, taking in his disheveled appearance and the marks on his wrists. Her expression hardened further. "What have they done to you?" Before he could answer, she turned to Captain Schultz. "I want every officer involved in this incident in front of me right now. And if a single piece of evidence mysteriously disappears, I will personally ensure that obstruction of justice charges are filed." By now, news vans were pulling up outside the station. Someone had leaked the arrest to the media, and the story of a black federal judge being racially profiled was spreading like wildfire. Captain Schultz was sweating profusely. "Judge Montgomery, please understand, this was all a misunderstanding. We're prepared to release Judge Wilson immediately with apologies." "Release him." Judge Montgomery's voice could have cut glass. He was never lawfully arrested in the first place. "You've falsely imprisoned a federal judge, Captain. That's just the beginning of your problems. Are you outraged by what these officers did to Judge Wilson?" Comment number 1, if you believe police officers should be held to higher standards, not lower ones. Hit like if you think Judge Wilson's position shouldn't matter. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity by law enforcement. What would you do if you were in Judge Wilson's shoes? Subscribe to find out how he fights back against this injustice and what happens when the blue wall tries to protect its own. The next part of this story will show you exactly why you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book knows every federal statute these officers just violated. The Wilson household buzzed with activity as Marcus sat in his study surrounded by a team of the nation's top civil rights attorneys. His suit had been exchanged for dry clothes, but the physical discomfort had merely been replaced by a cold determination that radiated from him like heat. Catherine moved between the kitchen and study, providing coffee and sandwiches while barely containing her fury. Her usual academic composure had given way to a mother lion's protective rage. Those officers need to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. She insisted setting down a fresh pot of coffee with more force than necessary. They humiliated you, endangered you, and violated everything their badges are supposed to represent. Marcus nodded his eyes, never leaving the documents before him. They will be Catherine, but this goes beyond two racist officers. This is about a system that enabled them, protected them, and would have covered for them if I had been anyone else. Olivia sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by files she'd pulled from online databases. Her law school training was being put to immediate practical use as she compiled previous complaints against Officers Brennan and Reynolds. "Dad, their record is appalling," she said, looking up from her laptop. 27 excessive force complaints between them in 7 years, all dismissed or marked unfounded. 19 of those complaints came from Black or Latino civilians. Marcus wasn't surprised. "And without my position, I would have been number 28. He turned to Maya Richardson, the lead attorney he'd retained for his personal lawsuit. "I want a two-pronged approach. First, my personal civil rights case against the officers, their supervisors, and the department. Second, and more importantly, I want a comprehensive DOJ investigation into the pattern and practice of discriminatory policing in Riverview." Maya nodded, making notes. "We'll file for emergency injunctive relief first thing tomorrow. With the evidence we already have, including multiple civilian videos of your arrest, we have a strong preliminary case. I've also spoken with contacts at the Civil Rights Division. They're already preparing to launch an investigation." The doorbell rang, and Catherine returned moments later with 2 FBI agents in tow. They introduced themselves as Special Agents Washburn and Chen from the Civil Rights Division. "Judge Wilson," Agent Washburn began, "we'd like to take your statement about today's events. The U.S. Attorney has fast-tracked this case personally. For the next 2 hours, Marcus methodically recounted every detail of his encounter from the moment the police cruiser appeared behind him to his eventual release from the station. The agents recorded his statement, photographed the marks on his wrists, and collected his rain-soaked clothing as evidence. "The officers planted drugs in my vehicle," Marcus stated. "I need assurance that evidence will be secured before it can be removed or replaced. We've already impounded your car as evidence, Agent Chen assured him, "and we've secured the body camera footage and station surveillance videos. Captain Schultz tried to prevent us from accessing them, but a federal judge signed warrants for all electronic records an hour ago." While the agents were still taking his statement, Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed Riverview City Hall. "Mayor Henderson," Marcus said to the room before declining the call. "He can speak to my attorneys." The mayor had been blowing up his phone since his release, desperately trying to contain the public relations nightmare unfolding in his city. Maya raised an eyebrow. "He's already offered a 7-figure settlement if we keep this quiet." Marcus shook his head firmly. "This isn't about money. This is about accountability and systematic change." By evening, the story had exploded across national news networks. Video footage of Marcus being slammed against his car, handcuffed in the rain, while clearly stating he was a federal judge, had gone viral. The country was witnessing yet another example of racial profiling, but this time the victim possessed the knowledge, resources, and position to fight back effectively. As Marcus watched, the coverage memories surfaced from his early days as a young black attorney. The security guards who followed him around courthouses, assuming he was a defendant rather than a lawyer. The judges who expressed surprise at his articulate arguments. The clients who requested someone else when they saw his face. He had persevered then, climbing to one of the highest positions in the legal system, but the indignities had never fully stopped. They had merely changed form. "You should recuse yourself from the police brutality case," Catherine suggested gently, sitting beside him. "No one would blame you after what's happened." Marcus turned to her with resolve in his eyes. "That's exactly what they want. That's why this happened, Catherine. Those threatening notes, this random traffic stop in the same jurisdiction as my pending case. This was meant to intimidate me. If I recuse myself, they win." The following morning, Marcus returned to the bench. His colleagues had offered him time off, but he refused. Walking into the courthouse in his judicial robes, head held high despite the whispers and stares, was its own form of resistance. When the Riverview Police Department's attorney filed an emergency motion for his recusal from the pending brutality case, citing conflict of interest due to his personal lawsuit, Marcus called a special hearing. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public. Marcus addressed the motion with the measured control that had made him a respected jurist. "Counsel suggests that my personal experience of racial profiling and abuse at the hands of Riverview police officers creates a conflict of interest that prevents me from fairly adjudicating this case," he stated, looking directly at the department's attorneys. "I would suggest instead that it provides me with a perspective that is sorely lacking on the federal bench. Nevertheless, I take allegations of bias seriously." He paused, letting the tension build in the silent courtroom. The standard for recusal is whether a reasonable person, knowing all the circumstances, would question the judge's impartiality. My impartiality is not determined by my race, nor by being a victim of the very conduct alleged in this case. If that were true, no female judge could hear a sexual harassment case. No judge who had been burglarized could hear a theft case. His voice remained measured, but took on a steely quality. "I find that the motion for recusal is without merit and appears to be a tactical maneuver to avoid judicial scrutiny by someone intimately familiar with the issues at hand. The motion is denied." That afternoon, Marcus received word that the Department of Justice was formally opening a pattern or practice investigation into the Riverview Police Department. Additionally, the U.S. Attorney was convening a grand jury to consider criminal civil rights charges against officers Brennan and Reynolds. The legal machinery that would transform Riverview had begun to move, set in motion by a single traffic stop and the man who refused to let it be just another statistic. The federal courthouse steps were crowded with journalists and camera crews when officers Ryan Brennan and Jason Reynolds were led up in handcuffs flanked by U.S. Marshals. Gone were their uniforms and the arrogant swagger that had characterized their encounter with Marcus. Instead, they wore civilian clothes and expressions of disbelief that they were actually facing consequences. the indictment handed down by the grand jury was damning deprivation of civil rights under color of law, falsifying evidence, lying in official reports, witness intimidation, and conspiracy charges that carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. The arrests sent shockwaves through the Riverview Police Department. The blue wall of silence that had protected problem officers for decades was beginning to crumble under federal scrutiny. Internal affairs files that had mysteriously remained sealed were now being opened by FBI agents armed with federal warrants. What they revealed was a pattern of behavior that stretched far beyond Brennan and Reynolds. "We've identified at least 17 similar incidents involving these officers," Special Agent Washburn told Marcus during their weekly update meeting. "In each case, the victim was a person of color driving through Riverview. Complaints were filed, then buried. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses were pressured to recant." Marcus nodded, unsurprised, but still disturbed by the scope of the corruption. "And Captain Schultz." "The electronic trail leads directly to his office," Agent Chen confirmed. "He personally marked multiple complaints against Brennan and Reynolds as unfounded without investigation. We've also found evidence he coached them on how to write reports to justify their actions. The investigation was taking a toll on the officers' personal lives as well. Reynolds' wife had filed for divorce and taken their children to stay with her parents in Oregon. Brennan's fiancée had called off their engagement, returning the ring via certified mail. Their neighbors avoided eye contact when they ventured out to collect their mail. Former friends and colleagues suddenly had no time to return their calls. As the evidence mounted, former victims began coming forward with stories that echoed Marcus's experience. Terrell Jackson, a black medical student, described being dragged from his car during a traffic stop only to have a small bag of marijuana discovered in his vehicle, despite the fact that he had never used drugs in his life. Maria Gonzalez, a Latina business owner, recounted being sexually harassed during a stop, then threatened with deportation if she complained, despite being a natural-born citizen. Each story built upon the last, creating a damning portrait of systematic harassment and abuse. Officer Reynolds was the first to crack. Facing the prospect of decades in federal prison separated from his children, he approached prosecutors about a cooperation agreement. In exchange for his testimony against not only his partner, but also department leadership, he would plead guilty to lesser charges with a recommended sentence of 8 years. Brennan, meanwhile, remained defiant. "This is all political correctness gone mad," he told anyone who would listen. "We were doing our jobs keeping Riverview safe from criminals coming in from Oakland. Just because he turned out to be a judge doesn't change the fact that he was driving suspiciously." His police union initially provided legal representation, but as evidence of falsified reports and planted evidence mounted, they quietly withdrew their support. The preliminary bail hearing was held before Judge Eliza Dominguez, a colleague of Marcus, who recused himself from any direct involvement in the criminal cases. Marcus attended as an observer, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. The prosecutor, a sharp young assistant U.S. attorney named David Kim, argued forcefully against bail. "Your Honor, these defendants have demonstrated not only a willingness to violate the civil rights of citizens they swore to protect, but also to fabricate evidence, intimidate witnesses, and obstruct justice. Their former positions as police officers make them uniquely capable of evading supervision if released." Judge Dominguez denied bail, citing the serious nature of the charges and evidence that both officers had contacted potential witnesses despite explicit orders not to do so. As they were led away, Brennan caught sight of Marcus sitting in the gallery. The look of pure hatred he directed at the judge sent a chill through the courtroom. 2 days later, Captain Schultz was placed on administrative leave when internal investigators discovered emails ordering the deletion of complaint records following Marcus's arrest. The captain's attempt to cover his tracks had only created more evidence of obstruction. The investigation expanded to include Chief Richard Davis, who had allegedly established unwritten policies encouraging aggressive stops of suspicious vehicles, defined in practice as expensive cars driven by minorities. The dominoes were falling one by one. Reynolds's decision to cooperate opened floodgates of information. During lengthy debriefing sessions with federal prosecutors, he revealed a department culture that not only tolerated racial profiling, but actively encouraged it through informal quotas and preferential assignments. Officers who brought in high numbers of arrests from targeted neighborhoods received better shifts and overtime opportunities. Those who raised concerns were relegated to desk duty or undesirable patrols. Most damning of all, Reynolds confirmed what Marcus had suspected: his stop had not been random. After the threatening notes failed to intimidate the judge into recusing himself from the police brutality case, certain elements within the department had decided a more direct message was needed. While the stop hadn't been specifically ordered by leadership, Reynolds admitted that he and Brennan had been told to keep an eye out for Marcus's vehicle if it entered Riverview. "We were supposed to scare him, maybe find something minor to cite him for," Reynolds confessed. But Brennan took it further. He had this thing about successful black men, always said they must be hiding something illegal. When Judge Wilson questioned the stop, Brennan just lost it. As Reynolds cooperated, Brennan isolated himself further, refusing even his attorney's advice to consider a plea deal. His personality, once merely abrasive, turned openly bitter and racist. During a jailhouse interview with his attorney recorded by security cameras, he ranted about black privilege and how they always play the race card. These statements, made part of the public record during discovery, only strengthened the prosecution's case that racial animus had motivated his actions against Marcus. For Marcus, watching the officer's downfall brought complicated feelings. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served vindication in his experience, being validated by evidence and testimony. But there was also a deep sadness that in 21st century America, such blatant racism could still fester within institutions meant to protect all citizens equally. As the criminal cases against the officers proceeded toward trial, Marcus remained focused on the larger goal, not just punishing individual bad actors, but transforming a system that had protected them for so long. The officers' downfall was just the beginning. The Riverview Police Department headquarters, once a symbol of authority in the affluent suburb, now stood surrounded by protesters holding signs demanding justice for Judge Wilson and defund corrupt police. Inside, the atmosphere was equally turbulent as Department of Justice investigators combed through records, interviewed officers, and dismantled decades of institutional protection for discriminatory practices. The pattern or practice investigation launched by the Civil Rights Division had expanded beyond Marcus's case to encompass the entire department's history of interactions with minorities. Statistical evidence painted a damning picture. Black drivers were 6 times more likely to be stopped in Riverview than white drivers. Once stopped, they were 8 times more likely to be searched, despite searches of white drivers yielding contraband at higher rates. Latino drivers faced similar disparities. Use of force incidents involved minority subjects in 87% of cases, despite minorities making up less than 30% of those who drove through the jurisdiction. These numbers alone establish a clear pattern of discriminatory policing, stated the preliminary DOJ report, which had been leaked to the press. When combined with first-hand accounts from victims' internal communications revealing racial bias among command staff and the department's systematic failure to investigate complaints from minority citizens, the evidence points to a deeply entrenched culture of racism that violates the constitutional rights of non-white individuals entering Riverview. The investigation had expanded to neighboring departments as well, with evidence suggesting that discriminatory practices crossed jurisdictional lines, creating what one investigator called a gauntlet of harassment. for minorities traveling through predominantly white suburbs. 3 weeks after his arrest, Marcus testified before a congressional committee examining judicial harassment and threats to judicial independence. His testimony was measured but powerful, combining his personal experience with his deep knowledge of constitutional law. When officers can detain, assault, and falsely arrest a federal judge with impunity, imagine what happens to ordinary citizens without my resources and position, he told the packed hearing room. This is not about me. This is about a system that views black skin as inherently suspicious, that treats the Constitution as a suggestion rather than the supreme law of the land, and that shields its worst actors from accountability. The hearing was televised nationally, bringing renewed attention to issues of racial profiling and police accountability. Marcus became reluctantly but resolutely the face of a movement demanding reform. His quiet dignity and legal expertise made him a particularly effective advocate, difficult for opponents to dismiss or discredit. Back in Riverview, the fallout continued. Chief Davis resigned rather than face termination, as evidence mounted of his role in establishing discriminatory policies. 6 more officers were suspended as investigation revealed their involvement in similar incidents or attempts to cover up misconduct. Captain Schultz, facing both criminal charges and civil liability, was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for leniency. The City Council held emergency meetings to address the crisis. Mayor Henderson, who had initially tried to minimize the incident, now faced a recall campaign organized by community activists. His attempts to reach Marcus continued to be rebuffed. The judge would only communicate through his attorneys, who made it clear that no settlement would be considered without comprehensive departmental reforms. Catherine had stepped into an activist role that complemented her academic expertise. She organized a community forum on policing reform that drew hundreds of attendees from Riverview and surrounding communities. "This is not about punishing all police officers," she told the crowd. "This is about creating systems of accountability that protect both citizens and good officers. No one benefits when badges become shields for bigotry." Olivia, meanwhile, had been instrumental in assembling a class action lawsuit representing other victims of the Riverview Police Department's discriminatory practices. Working with Marcus's legal team, she helped identify patterns that connected dozens of seemingly isolated incidents into a coherent narrative of systematic abuse. For Marcus himself, the public role was challenging. As a judge, he had spent his career cultivating impartiality and avoiding the spotlight. Now he found himself at the center of a national conversation about race and policing. He struggled to balance his duty to the judiciary with his commitment to justice in its broader sense. The department's attempts to paint him as an activist with an agenda rather than an impartial jurist had failed, but the attacks took their toll nonetheless. Every public statement had to be carefully considered, every interview meticulously prepared. The evidence compiled by DOJ investigators was overwhelming. Beyond statistical disparities, they discovered explicit racial comments in department emails, training materials that encouraged officers to view minorities as potential threats, and an internal review process designed to dismiss civilian complaints rather than investigate them. Most disturbing was the discovery of an unofficial quota system that rewarded officers for arrests in predominantly minority areas while discouraging enforcement of similar offenses in white neighborhoods. The department has systematically violated the 4th and 14th Amendment rights of minorities for at least the past decade, concluded the final DOJ report. Remedial action must be immediate, comprehensive, and subject to ongoing federal oversight. The report recommended that the Riverview Police Department be placed under a consent decree, a court-enforced agreement requiring specific reforms and regular monitoring by federal authorities. The City Council, faced with the alternative of a lengthy and expensive federal lawsuit they were certain to lose, voted to accept the consent decree despite the mayor's objections. Do you believe a federal judge receiving this treatment shows how deeply rooted discrimination is in some police departments? Comment number 1 if you think Judge Wilson's case is just the tip of the iceberg. Hit like if you're shocked by the statistical evidence revealed in the DOJ investigation. Subscribe to see what happens when a department built on discrimination is forced to reform. Will they make meaningful changes or just perform for the cameras? The most surprising revelations are still to come as we follow Judge Wilson's continued fight for justice. What would true accountability look like in your community? The persistent nightmare always began the same way: rain streaking down a car window, blue lights flashing, the cold circle of a gun barrel pressed against his temple. Marcus would wake gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the phantom sensation of handcuffs still biting into his wrists. 3 months after the incident, the physical marks had faded, but the psychological impact remained etched in his psyche. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, checking the time, 4:17 a.m. Catherine stirred beside him. "Same dream?" she asked softly, reaching for his hand in the darkness. He nodded, then remembered she couldn't see the gesture. "Yes, it's getting less frequent at least." That was true, but other symptoms had emerged to replace the nightmares. The hypervigilance whenever he drove, the way his heart raced when he spotted a police cruiser in his rearview mirror, the careful mental mapping of routes to avoid Riverview and similar suburbs. He'd begun taking the long way to work, adding 30 minutes to his commute to stay within the diverse neighborhoods of Oakland where he felt safer. Catherine had noticed his withdrawal from family activities as well. He'd declined 3 dinner invitations from colleagues in the past month, canceled their traditional Sunday drives along the coast, and sent his regrets to his nephew's graduation celebration in Sacramento. The thought of being in unfamiliar areas, potentially interacting with police officers who didn't know him, had become quietly terrifying. Dr. Winters said these reactions are normal, Marcus reminded both Catherine and himself. The therapist he'd reluctantly agreed to see had diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder, assuring him that his symptoms were a natural response to a life-threatening situation compounded by racial trauma. "Normal doesn't mean you have to endure them alone," Catherine replied, sitting up and turning on the bedside lamp. At 55, her face showed lines of worry that hadn't been there before the incident. "We're all affected by this, Marcus. Me, Olivia, your colleagues. Shutting us out doesn't protect us." She was right, of course. Olivia had changed too, her idealistic approach to law tempered by harsh reality. She had always been passionate about social justice, but now there was an edge to her advocacy, a hardness born from watching her father, her hero and role model, humiliated and traumatized despite all his accomplishments. She had thrown herself into work with the ACLU, focusing specifically on police accountability cases, her previous interest in immigration law set aside. Marcus worried about the burden of anger she now carried. The family vacation they had planned to Martha's Vineyard had been canceled after Marcus received the first death threat. The letter postmarked from Riverview had contained a single bullet and the words, "Race traitors die first." The FBI had taken it seriously enough to assign a security detail to the Wilson home and to Marcus's chambers at the courthouse. Armed agents now accompanied him to and from work, remaining discreetly present during court sessions. Catherine had been assigned protection as well, given the reference to race traitors in the plural. The protective measures were necessary, but added to Marcus's sense of his life being fundamentally altered. Standing, Marcus walked to the window and looked out at the agents in the unmarked car parked across the street. They were there for his protection, yet their presence was a constant reminder of his vulnerability. "I've dedicated my life to working within the system," he said quietly. "I believed that change happens incrementally through precedent and procedure. Now I find myself questioning everything." Catherine joined him at the window, wrapping her robe more tightly around herself. "That's not necessarily a bad thing, Marcus. Systems need questioning, especially by those who understand them best." The next day, Marcus had lunch with his mentor, retired Judge William Thompson. At 82, Thompson had been among the first black federal judges appointed in California, breaking barriers that made Marcus's own path possible. They sat in the private dining room of Thompson's club, where the old judge was still treated with reverence despite his retirement. "You're carrying too much sun," Thompson observed, studying Marcus over his half-glasses. "I can see it in your posture, hear it in your voice. This case has become your crusade." Marcus sighed, setting down his fork. "Is that wrong? Should I just move on, pretend it never happened?" Thompson shook his head. "That's not what I'm saying. There's a difference between seeking justice and being consumed by it. Your position gives you unique power to effect change, but you need to decide how to use that power without letting it use you up." The conversation continued for hours, touching on Thompson's own experiences with racism in the judiciary, the progress made, and ground still to cover. By the time they parted, Marcus had reached a decision he would use his position and this incident not just for personal vindication, but for structural change that would outlast any individual case. The officer's trial began the following week, though Marcus had recused himself from any official involvement he attended as an observer sitting in the back of the courtroom. The media presence was intense, cameras crowding the courthouse steps each morning, reporters shouting questions that Marcus politely declined to answer. Inside the proceedings were methodical. The prosecution presented video evidence from multiple angles, testimony from witnesses who had recorded the incident, and expert analysis of the officer's violation of department policies and constitutional protections. Officer Reynolds, as part of his plea agreement, testified against his former partner, describing their pattern of targeting minorities and the department culture that encouraged it. Brennan's defense attempted to portray the incident as a reasonable mistake, a momentary overreaction rather than evidence of racial bias. This strategy collapsed when prosecutors introduced Brennan's history of similar mistakes, all involving minorities, and jailhouse recordings of his racist comments. Marcus watched it all with a detached, analytical mind, the same way he observed arguments in his own courtroom. There was a surreal quality to seeing himself in the evidence. Dash camera footage of his arrest, photographs of his injuries, his soaked clothing entered as exhibits. It was as if the person in those images was someone else, a stranger, whose humiliation he could observe without reliving. The trial dominated local news and received significant national coverage. Marcus had become, despite his natural reserve, a symbol, to some of racial progress and resilience, to others of judicial overreach and identity politics. He received hundreds of letters weekly, most supportive, but some containing threats or racial slurs. His clerks sorted through them, preserving the threatening ones for FBI investigation and organizing the supportive ones by theme. One evening, after reviewing a particularly moving letter from a young black law student who cited Marcus as her inspiration for pursuing a judicial career, he found himself taking out his laptop and beginning to write. It had not been his intention to author a memoir, but the words flowed with surprising ease. This was not just his story, but a lens through which to examine the justice system itself, its aspirations and failures, its power to protect and to harm. Writing became therapeutic, a way to process his experience, while transforming it into something constructive. As the trial progressed and media attention continued, Marcus found himself increasingly drawn to broader advocacy. He accepted an invitation to deliver the keynote address at the annual conference of the Black Judges Association, where he spoke not just about his personal experience, but about the structural reforms necessary to create a truly equitable justice system. "Our robes do not shield us from racism," he told the assembled judges, "but they do give us a unique position from which to address it. We cannot be neutral on issues of justice. Neutrality in the face of injustice only serves the oppressor." The speech received a standing ovation and was widely reported in legal publications. More importantly, it sparked conversations within judicial conferences across the country about the role of judges in addressing systemic racism. Through all of this, Marcus found his way back to his family. The shared mission for justice had become a bridge, reconnecting him to Catherine and Olivia. Their Sunday dinners resumed now, often including strategy sessions for the ongoing reforms. The nightmares became less frequent, the hypervigilance less acute. He was not the same man he had been before that rainy afternoon in Riverview, but perhaps the man he had become was better equipped for the challenges ahead. The federal courthouse was standing room only when the jury returned their verdict in the case of United States v. Brennan and Reynolds. After 5 days of deliberation, they found both officers guilty on all counts, including deprivation of civil rights under color of law, falsification of evidence, and conspiracy charges. Marcus sat in the back row, his expression carefully neutral, as the forewoman read the lengthy list of guilty verdicts. Beside him, Catherine squeezed his hand tightly at each pronouncement. Across the aisle, Olivia sat with the legal team that had assembled the class action lawsuit on behalf of other victims. Officer Jason Reynolds, having cooperated extensively with prosecutors, received an 8-year sentence in accordance with his plea agreement. He would serve his time in a minimum security federal prison separated from the general population for his protection as a former police officer. Ryan Brennan, who had maintained his innocence and shown no remorse throughout the trial, received 15 years. The judge cited his persistent pattern of racist conduct and abuse of authority as factors in the enhanced sentence. The courtroom remained silent as Brennan was led away, the former officer's face a mask of hatred directed at Marcus's back. 2 weeks later, Captain Richard Schultz pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and conspiracy charges, accepting a 5-year sentence in exchange for his continued cooperation in the expanding investigation of departmental leadership. His testimony implicated former Chief Davis in establishing unofficial policies that encouraged discriminatory policing, leading to additional charges against the former chief. The federal consent decree imposed on the Riverview Police Department was the most comprehensive in recent history. It mandated complete restructuring of department leadership, new training protocols focused on implicit bias and de-escalation, community oversight mechanisms, and regular audits of traffic stops and use of force incidents to identify racial disparities. The decree would remain in effect for a minimum of 10 years, with federal monitors maintaining regular oversight of departmental operations. Mayor Henderson, who had survived the recall attempt by a narrow margin, publicly committed to making Riverview a national model for police reform. Few believed his sudden conversion, but the consent decree left him little choice but to comply. The original police brutality lawsuit that had been before Marcus's court proceeded with new evidence uncovered during the federal investigation. The case was reassigned to another judge after Marcus recused himself, citing his personal involvement in related matters. The plaintiff, a young black teacher who had been severely beaten during a traffic stop similar to Marcus's, was awarded $8 million in damages. More importantly, the verdict established legal precedent for holding departments accountable for pattern or practice violations. Catherine accepted a position on the newly established Community Oversight Board for the Riverview Police Department, bringing her academic expertise in social justice to the practical work of reform. The board was granted unprecedented access to departmental records and significant input on policy changes, a concession the City Council had fought until federal pressure became overwhelming. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself nominated for the Thurgood Marshall Award for Judicial Excellence, a prestigious recognition that acknowledged not just his legal acumen, but his courage in confronting systemic injustice. He accepted the honor with mixed emotions, uncomfortable with being celebrated for what he viewed as simply surviving and responding to racism. The attention brought new scrutiny as well. Conservative legal commentators questioned whether his advocacy had compromised his judicial impartiality. Op-eds debated the proper role of judges in reform movements. Marcus navigated these waters carefully, aware that his every statement would be analyzed for evidence of bias. The Justice Department building on evidence uncovered in Riverview expanded its investigation to 3 neighboring police departments where similar patterns of discriminatory policing had emerged. Marcus provided guidance to the investigators based on his experience, but maintained appropriate judicial distance from the operational aspects of these investigations. In the state legislature, bipartisan support emerged for what became known as the Judge Wilson Act, establishing new standards for police accountability and civilian oversight throughout the state. The act included provisions for independent investigation of all police shootings and in-custody deaths, mandatory body cameras with strict penalties for deactivation, and a statewide database of officer misconduct to prevent problem officers from simply moving to new departments. Marcus testified before the legislative committee, considering the act offering measured but powerful testimony about the importance of structural reform. Individual prosecutions, while necessary, address symptoms rather than causes, he told the legislators. Without systematic change, we will continue to see the same abuses regardless of how many individual officers are held accountable. Despite his discomfort with being the namesake for legislation, Marcus recognized the symbolic importance of the act and its potential impact on policing practices statewide. The act passed with a veto-proof majority and was signed into law by the governor in a ceremony that Marcus politely declined to attend. As the reforms took root, Marcus found himself reflecting on conversations with his father decades earlier. The elder Wilson had lived through the civil rights era, participating in marches and voter registration drives in the South before moving his family to Harlem. He had maintained a cautious optimism about American progress while warning his son that such progress was neither inevitable nor linear. Justice requires eternal vigilance, he had often said. Each generation must fight the same battles in new forms. Now, as Marcus watched body camera footage of Riverview's newly trained officers conducting professional, respectful traffic stops, he wondered what his father would make of these changes. Were they substantial and sustainable, or merely cosmetic adjustments that would erode with time and changing political winds? The personal vindication of seeing his abusers convicted meant little compared to these larger questions of systemic change. That was the real measure of justice. Not what happened to individual officers, but whether the system that produced and protected them was fundamentally transformed. 1 year to the day after his arrest, Marcus Wilson drove the same route through Riverview. The weather was better this time. Sunshine instead of rain, the streets dry, the sky clear blue. Catherine sat beside him, tension evident in her posture despite her attempts to appear relaxed. The security detail that had been part of their lives for months followed at a discreet distance 2 FBI agents in an unmarked car. "You don't have to do this," Catherine said as they crossed the city limits into Riverview. "No one would think less of you for avoiding this place entirely." Marcus kept his eyes on the road, hands steady at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, a habit he had never broken despite decades of safe driving. "I need to know if anything has really changed, Catherine. Reports and statistics can tell us part of the story, but seeing it firsthand matters." Riverview itself looked different. New signage welcomed visitors to the city, emphasizing its commitment to being an inclusive community. The police station, once an imposing, brutalist structure, had been renovated with glass walls and community meeting spaces, a physical manifestation of the transparency the consent decree demanded. As they approached the spot where Officers Brennan and Reynolds had pulled him over a year earlier, Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly. He took a deep breath, employing the techniques his therapist had taught him for managing anxiety. Before they reached the infamous corner, however, flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Catherine tensed visibly. "Marcus, it's all right," he said, though his own pulse had quickened. "Let's see how this goes." He signaled carefully and pulled to the curb in exactly the same spot as the year before. The cruiser behind them had "Community Policing" emblazoned on its side in friendly blue letters. 2 officers emerged, a young black woman, and a Latino man, both in their early 30s. They approached with professional courtesy, stopping at a respectful distance from the vehicle. "Good morning, sir, ma'am," the female officer said, bending slightly to make eye contact through the window Marcus had lowered halfway. "I'm Officer Janelle Washington. This is my partner, Officer Miguel Rodriguez. You have a tail light out on the passenger side. Just wanted to let you know so you can get it fixed." Marcus studied her face, finding no trace of the contempt that had characterized his previous encounter in this exact location. "Thank you, Officer Washington. I wasn't aware of that." "No problem, sir. May I see your license and registration, please?" "This won't result in a citation, just a fix-it notice." Marcus reached slowly for his wallet, noting that neither officer had a hand near their weapon. As he handed over his documents, Officer Washington's eyes widened in recognition. "Judge Wilson," she said, her professional demeanor momentarily slipping. "Yes," Marcus confirmed. Officer Washington straightened clearly, flustered. "Sir, we had no idea. I mean, we weren't targeting—" Marcus raised a hand gently. "I believe you, officer. This seems like a legitimate traffic safety stop conducted professionally. That's exactly how it should be." The officer visibly relaxed. "Thank you, sir. Well, your case has been central to our new training protocols. All officers now go through an extensive program on implicit bias and constitutional policing. Chief Robinson has made it clear that what happened to you will never happen again in Riverview." Chief Amara Robinson, the African-American woman who had been appointed to lead the department after the consent decree, had reached out to Marcus several times during the transition. Her background in community policing and civil rights law made her an ideal choice to implement the mandated reforms. "How are the changes being received within the department?" Marcus asked. Officer Rodriguez, who had remained respectfully silent, stepped forward. "Honestly, sir, there was resistance at first. Change is hard, especially for officers who'd been here a long time. But the newer officers, like us, we welcome it. This is how policing should be, respectful, constitutional, community-focused." After completing the fix-it notice, both officers apologized for the inconvenience and thanked Marcus for his understanding. As they walked back to their cruiser, Marcus turned to Catherine. "That was, different." Catherine squeezed his hand. "Yes, it was. But one professional stop doesn't mean the entire culture has changed." "Agreed, but it's a start." Later that afternoon, they attended a community celebration marking the one-year anniversary of the consent decree. The event, held in Riverview's Central Park, brought together police officers, community members, and city officials in what would have been an unimaginable gathering 12 months earlier. Chief Robinson spotted Marcus and Catherine as they arrived, making her way through the crowd to greet them personally. "Judge Wilson, Dr. Wilson, thank you for coming. Your presence means a great deal." The chief, a commanding presence despite her petite stature, had implemented sweeping changes in her 10 months leading the department. Every officer had been required to reapply for their position with extensive background checks and psychological evaluations. New hiring practices emphasized emotional intelligence and community connections alongside traditional qualifications. The demographic makeup of the force had shifted dramatically now, much closer to reflecting the diversity of the region. "The statistical improvements are impressive," Marcus acknowledged, referencing the quarterly reports required by the consent decree. "Traffic stops are down 40% overall, while the racial disparity in those stops has decreased by 70%. Use of force incidents are down 60%. Chief Robinson nodded. "Numbers matter, but culture matters more. That's the harder change, shifting how officers think about their role in the community. We're making progress, but it's a daily effort." As they spoke, Marcus noticed a familiar face in the crowd, Officer Jason Reynolds' wife Laura, with their 2 children. She had returned to Riverview after the trial, determined to rebuild her life in the community despite her husband's disgrace. After some hesitation, Marcus approached her. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm surprised to see you here." Laura Reynolds straightened protective arms around her children's shoulders. "Judge Wilson, we're trying to move forward. The children and I shouldn't have to leave our home because of Jason's actions." "I agree completely," Marcus said gently. "How is he doing?" She seemed surprised by the question. "He's coping. The minimum security facility is better than it could have been. He's taking courses, participating in restorative justice programs. He asks about the reforms here. I think he's genuinely trying to understand where he went wrong." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Would you tell him something from me? Tell him I recognize the courage it took to break the blue wall of silence. His testimony helped make these changes possible." Tears welled in Laura's eyes. "Thank you. That will mean a lot to him." The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected letter forwarded through his attorney. The return address was the Federal Correctional Institution where Ryan Brennan was serving his 15-year sentence. He opened it with caution, half expecting more threats or racist vitriol. Instead, he found a 3-page handwritten letter that began with a surprising sentence, "I am writing to apologize for what I did to you." And the letter continued describing Brennan's gradual recognition of how his upbringing, training, and the police culture had shaped his views on race. He didn't ask for forgiveness or a reduced sentence, acknowledging that some mistakes can't be undone. The final paragraph read, "I don't expect you to believe me or care about my regrets, but I wanted you to know that your case has forced me to confront truths about myself I spent a lifetime avoiding. If there is any silver lining to this dark cloud, perhaps it's that one more racist cop has finally seen the humanity in the people he once profiled." Marcus folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He wasn't ready to respond, wasn't sure if he ever would be. But the letter represented something important, the possibility that even the most entrenched attitudes could change. That evening, the Wilson family gathered for a special dinner. Olivia had graduated law school with honors and accepted a position with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Her experience with the class action lawsuit had cemented her commitment to civil rights work. "I have news," Marcus announced as they finished their meal, the same mushroom risotto he had planned to cook the day of his arrest. "I've been approached about a possible nomination to the Supreme Court. The current administration is looking to fill an upcoming vacancy." Catherine and Olivia both froze forks midair. "Dad, that's incredible," Olivia breathed. "It's your dream." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "It was, but I've decided to decline consideration." "What? Why?" Catherine asked. "Because I can do more where I am now. On the Supreme Court, I'd be one voice among 9 constrained by the cases that reach that level. Here I can continue working directly on police reform, mentoring young lawyers, and building on the momentum we've created." He reached for Catherine's hand. "It's not a sacrifice. It's a choice to be effective rather than elevated." The conversation continued late into the night, touching on their plans for the future. The scholarship they had established for minority law students had already funded 10 promising candidates. Catherine's work on the Oversight Board was creating a model being studied by other cities. Olivia's position with DOJ would allow her to apply the lessons from Riverview nationally. 2 weeks later, Marcus welcomed a new group of law clerks to his chambers. Among them was Darius Jackson, a brilliant young graduate from Riverview whose father had been one of the victims in the class action lawsuit. As Marcus showed the clerks around the courthouse, he found himself reflecting on his father's words about the arc of justice. Progress wasn't linear or inevitable. It required vigilance, courage, and persistence. The system could work when people fought to make it work, not just for themselves, but for everyone. The journey wasn't over. Riverview was just one department in one city. Brennan and Reynolds were just 2 officers among many who abused their power. The consent decree would eventually expire. Eternal vigilance remained the price of liberty. But standing there with the next generation of legal minds, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Not naive optimism, but the hard-earned hope that comes from seeing change happen and committing to continue the work no matter how long it takes. Have you ever witnessed a moment when justice was finally served after a long struggle? Comment below and share your experience. Your story might inspire others who are still fighting. If you believe that one person with courage can truly make a difference in creating systemic change, hit that like button to show your support for Judge Wilson's journey. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories of individuals standing up against discrimination and winning. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes justice prevails even when the odds seem impossible. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey from injustice to accountability. Remember, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But only when brave individuals like Judge Wilson help bend it. Judge Marcus Wilson's journey teaches us that true justice requires more than individual victories. It demands systemic change. His story shows that even those with power and privilege aren't immune to racial profiling, but also demonstrates how privilege can be leveraged for collective good. The case reveals how deeply racism can be embedded in institutions, requiring comprehensive reform rather than just removing bad apples. We learn that accountability must happen at all levels, from individual officers to department leadership to oversight systems. Judge Wilson's decision to fight publicly rather than settle privately illustrates that personal vindication means little without structural transformation. His willingness to use his trauma as a catalyst for reform shows remarkable courage and commitment to justice. The story reminds us that progress isn't inevitable. It requires vigilance, documentation, community pressure, and legal action. Most importantly, it teaches us that change is possible when we refuse to accept the status quo, even when that means confronting powerful systems. The arc of justice bends only when brave individuals help bend it. Have you ever witnessed discrimination that went unchallenged because the victim lacked resources or position? Share your story in the comments. If you believe systemic racism requires systemic solutions, hit that like button to support stories that expose injustice. Subscribe to see more powerful narratives about individuals standing against discrimination and making real change. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how racial profiling affects people at every level of society. Thank you for joining us on Judge Wilson's journey from humiliation to transformation. Remember, justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoers, it's about creating systems where such wrongs can't happen in the first place.